Today, we will try to understand the relationship between language and culture. Remember, we are looking at a very complex relationship between language and society. The concept or the idea that is embedded in our understanding of culture also interacts in a very complex way with society. So, a combination of the three, that is society, language and culture, creates a very complex phenomena, and in order to understand the relationship between language and culture, it is almost imperative that we do not avoid a discussion on culture. In short, culture interacts and intersects the two, language and society, in a big way. We will try to understand with some examples and some work that has been done before, and we will try to see how these two things work and what kind of complexities, what kind of complex questions they create for us to understand and to answer. First, let us look at what culture and what language would mean. As we understand, language is a complex and a role governed system. It is a system of sounds, words and sentences. And then when we look at the relationship between language and society, we have established that what starts operating in a big way is the understanding of language at the level of discourse. So, it is a complex system of arbitrary sounds, words, sentences and discourse, and then we have spent fair amount of time in understanding language. Culture, in the simplest possible description of the term, is the way of life. Everything that an individual or a group of individuals which would form a community or a society would do would constitute culture. Everything that we do is part of culture. That is to say, in order to understand culture, we would need to pay attention to everything that an individual or a group touch. And as we have seen, language plays an important role in the way people live and the way people's life work. It shows up in a big way in language. In other words, language serves as a window for understanding culture and components of culture as well. Moving on, in our understanding of culture, we would also like to see that the culture began when speech was present, and from then on, the enrichment of their means the further development of the other. It only establishes the complex relationship between language and culture. And what follows from the interactions and the relationship between the two, that is language and culture, we understand that while learning language, children learn cultural complexities as well, and they develop their cognitive abilities. That is, the development of cognitive abilities among children, among the learners, includes the components of culture and cultural complexities. So, the cultural component cannot be separated from learning, and in particular learning of language. It's part of the learning process and it's part of the development of cognitive abilities. In the context of education, Piaget has a theory of cognitive development, and he presents sets of argument in support of that, and there would be a position which would not want to look at embedded cultural complexities in language, but for the purpose of understanding the kinds of relationships we are witnessing between language and society, we would like to understand and rather admit that the cultural components of language is important for us to understand if we are trying to understand learning of language, and they work in a very complex way. How we conclude this part is we acquire language with input from immediate environment, and we do not acquire a language, it has been, we established that, and what we want to add to that we do not acquire language minus culture, that is the cultural complexities embedded in language becomes part of language acquisition as well. That is, the way the underlying grammar of culture operates is probably simultaneously with the underlying computation of language that works in human mind. So, people have gone to the extent of saying things like language is culture and culture is language. Whether or not we agree with this term, with this type of description is not really relevant for our discussion right now, but we would want to understand this thing in the spirit, and it appears to be the fact that such a thing only talks about the role of cultural components in acquisition and learning of language. So, now we understand the relationship between language and culture and how it is associated with language in an inseparable way. Then when we move further, we would like to know that language, thought and culture are closely related with each other, but then we would need to understand what is the nature of such a relationship. Note, with the language and culture, we are bringing thought, that is how people think. Please remember that we have defined culture as a way of life, and how people think in everything that they do, which becomes eventually components of culture, the role of how they think is integrated with that, and these things have got implications for each other. We would definitely need to answer questions like, does language determine culture, or is it the other way around? What is primary, language or thought? What is the relationship between language and thought? Apart from culture, does language determine our thought as well? These are the questions that has been answered, and one would like to answer these questions. The sort of answer comes from what is famously known as Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. A chemical engineer by profession, Benjamin Whorf, got interested in understanding the complex relationship between language and thought while he was studying language with one of the top linguists of his time, Edward Sapir. And the outcome of their project came to be known as Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. There are arguments in favor and against this hypothesis, both. We will also see how we find evidence in support of this argument and also against the fundamentals of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. But let us understand first what Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is about and how it helps us understand the complex relationship between language and culture in particular, and then also language and thought. So, according to this hypothesis, thinking is dependent on language. They start with this idea that language determines thought, and this is a stronger part of the hypothesis. It is also known in literature as linguistic determinism. such an hypothesis was arrived at, or Benjamin Warp started with this while he was studying American Indian indigenous languages. He has studied several of them, to name a few, like Hopi and Nocta, and then he, based on his time that he has spent with these things and based on what he has found, he presents certain arguments in support of his hypothesis. So, the same hypothesis, which is known as Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, also holds that because languages differ from one another in many ways, speakers of different languages perceive and experience the world differently relative to their linguistic background. That is, how an individual perceives the world is rooted in the language that the speaker has got, or the language he speaks. And this is the notion which is part of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and it is weaker in a sense, and this is known as linguistic relativism. So, in short, it says our experience in the world, our world view depends on the language that we speak. If we elaborate on this, we come to the point that the way language works, the way the structure of language works for the speakers of that language, and such a thing becomes helpful in structuring their thought patterns, and in a way it feeds to the stronger version, what is known as linguistic determinism. It was very famous at a time, but little later people found arguments against both linguistic determinism and linguistic relativism, that is, both parts of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. We will look at some of these things, and but before we look at the argument, in terms of the evidence that have been presented to counter Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, let's look at one or two examples on the basis of which Sapir and Whorf reached the conclusions of linguistic determinism and linguistic relativism. So, differences in a structure correspond to different ways of perceiving the world, and to support that, the example that this hypothesis presents is the following. So, there are two parts of English sentences, one is the subject and the predicate. This is kind of principle that operates in linguistic theory in understanding of a sentence. The idea in the modern time, that is in particular post 1957, was these two parts are significant for construction of a sentence. The expression of any given situation is divided into an agent and an action. So, two parts of a sentence, that is subject and predicate. Two parts of this division into agent and action is part of English. However, Hopi, an American Indian language, does not show this kind of distinction between subject and predicate. That is, a verb can exist independent of a subject. In Hopi sentences, we do not need a subject. The argument that Whorf presents, that Hopi does not need a subject, and he goes into examples of, so we in English we can say, look at the examples on the screen. A light flashed. So, we need to say a light and then flashed. However, in Hopi the same thing can be expressed with simple words, which is given on the screen, and it means flash occurred. This happens in many languages of the world, and this was presented as an example that in support of how English and American Indian languages differ from one another in terms of the construction of their sentences. And then Worf concludes that this has implications for how English speakers perceive the world and how speakers of American Indian languages would perceive the world. To see, let us look at another example. So, the action of flashing and the agent of light are combined together. What English speakers perceive is mainly the action, while Hopi speakers perceives the state. Similarly, English and Nootka are different for Worf in the sense that a subject predicate language presents a bipolar worldview, that is, for the way English speakers would perceive the world is always going to be bipolar, whereas a language with subject predicate combined pattern would present a holistic worldview, would always have a holistic worldview, which is also known as synthetic worldview. So, this difference in the worldview of bipolar and synthetic or holistic is not abstracted from external world, but preconditioned by the different languages the people speak. So, the point that Worf is making is very simple, that the world view and the experience that people have is determined by the structure of the language that they speak. And this is what he is trying to show with the examples from English, Hopi and Nootka. And he has presented that because English has the structure which follows subject verb and predicate pattern, and it follows agent and action pattern, but Nootka and Hopi would present the structure which is holistic, synthetic, and in those languages you do not really need a subject, and therefore they have such a world view and such experience of their lives. A word of caution here, one would still like to investigate whether or not American Indian languages really are without subjects. I am sure it has been investigated in great details. I would invite you to take a look at and find it out, because subjects and predicates are two essential patterns, to part of a principal essential patterns for construction of a sentence. Moving beyond, there were some arguments which were given against this hypothesis, and they were very powerful arguments. So, basically these arguments mean that the structure of the language would not really shape up how we think or how we perceive the world. And the first example comes from lexical units, that is words. We know that the relationship between the word and what a word means is quite arbitrary, and this is not a fundamental to a conceptual system. The speaker of one language with only one word for a specific concept, let us take the example of snow, do not mean, this situation does not mean that they are poorer in distinguishing between different kinds of snow. It has been argued that Eskimos have different types of snow and they have different words for snow. Please take another caution here, that this has been contested, that it is not really true, and people have not independently verified that really Eskimos have too many words for snow. In fact, there are few, but not as many as has been claimed. So, the point is not whether Eskimos have too many words for snow or not. The point is, if language A has got too many words for snow and language B has got only one word for snow, it is not fair for us to say that people with speakers of the language with fewer words for snow would not know how to distinguish between different types of snow. If this was not true, then we will have issues learning different languages. However, we know that we learn different languages sometimes pretty effortlessly and sometimes pretty well by putting some efforts in it. And that is the whole discussion of second language acquisition which we have done earlier. In terms of a structure as well, we find that the differences in grammatical structure of a language are not directly related to the differences in perceptual system of the speakers of these languages. Language structures and perceptual system are not interdependent. Language differences are mainly differences in surface structure. For example, English indicates the third person plural number by adding a morphological element to the end of a verb. The similar thing is done by different morphemes in different languages, but it is not true that the speakers of other languages would not understand how the singular number is indicated by a particular morpheme in English. Simultaneously, it also applies that English speakers do figure out how singular number or any other type of gender would be indicated in other languages. If we did not know these, if we did not know negotiating with these things, then we would not be learning the other language. So, what we see on the basis of lexical items and the structure is, it is not really, it does not hold the ground that language structures our thought. I mean, take more examples at the level of words. Sometimes we have talked about snow and we have talked about a situation where language A has got one word and language B has got more than one word. It is also possible that sometimes language A has got one word and language B has got no word for that thing or a concept, and still we understand that concept if we are not the speaker of language A. Take for example dupatta or rasgulla. For a speaker of Hindi, we understand these two words. There are not exact parallels of these two words in English, but English speakers do understand that dupatta is not really a scarf, dupatta is not really a long piece of cloth. It has a specific purpose and it has a specific meaning in its language, in the language and in the culture, and English speakers even with in the absence of the term understands the concept. And similarly, the same thing applies to the term rasgulla. And languages are full of these examples, and therefore, it is easily to point out that there are issues with Warpen hypothesis that language determines our worldview. So, what we see here is language is only the medium by which worldviews are expressed. Of course, worldviews are expressed through language, and the language system is not inherently, but what is also true and what appears to be true, that the language system is not inherently related to worldviews. It indicates worldviews, but it is not related in a serious sense with how it works, how the worldview works. The speakers with the same native language do not necessarily possess the same worldview. This is also true. Speakers of the same language have got different worldviews, while speakers of the different languages may share the same worldview. This is also true, and these sound pretty strong arguments. So far what we see as the conclusion is, undoubtedly the idea of the language, the terms and the notions represented by the terms like language, society and culture have got a very complex interrelationship with one another, but the argument that they are located in the structure of the language does not seem to be holding the ground. However, it is also impossible to completely refute the strength of superior verb hypothesis. In some cases, we do find some support in favor of superior verb hypothesis, that is to say, there are certain types of worldviews that are located in the structure of language. We will look at one example from Hindi, rather two examples from Hindi, to see how superior verb hypothesis could be supported, and really whether or not these examples work in support of superior verb hypothesis remains open for investigation. Let us consider these two examples. When someone says in Hindi, Raju kalam chahta hai, this sentence is perfectly grammatically normal sentence. However, there are problems with acceptability of this sentence. Speakers of the language Hindi would reach the conclusion that this is a grammatical sentence, but categorically this is not an acceptable sentence. We would need to investigate the difficulty in acceptability of this sentence. However, when we say Raju ko kalam chahiye, we change the sentence, the two sentences mean almost the same thing, then the sentence is acceptable. Now, a brief note on the structure of the language, that in sentence number 1, the sentence is called a direct sentence, and the meaning of direct is very simple, that the subject of the sentence, that is Raju, agrees with the verb. In example number 2, the subject of this, the logically what should be the subject of the sentence, Raju, does not seem to be in agreement with the verb, rather the verb does not indicate any agreement at all. It is a very unique kind of a verb in Hindi, chahiye. I invite you to look at the formation of the verb chahiye. This is probably the only verb in Hindi which does not undergo any change. It does not take any inflection on it, and it does not conjugate with tense or aspects or anything. It is neither the imperative form of the verb chahna. So, such a sentence is called indirect sentence, and this is my generalization, my conclusion, and I want to put this very strongly, even though it goes in support of Whorfian hypothesis, in the following way, that the fact that sentence number 1 is grammatical but not acceptable, and we need to explain the unacceptability of the sentence is pretty simple, that the sentence literally means Raju wants a pen, and the speakers of Hindi would not want to express the desire which is expressed by the term want in the direct fashion. The direct sentence where the subject shows agreement with the verb would not be acceptable even though grammatical, because it shows desire, and the speakers of Hindi would not want to reflect, would not want to underline their desire directly. What they do and the strategy that they apply to resolve this is they would convert the desire into a requirement and would make the sentence indirect, where the subject, the logical subject, would not be indicating any agreement with the verb, and then the sentence becomes perfectly both grammatical and acceptable. So, this seems to be going in support of Whorfian hypothesis. Let us take one more example of politeness. When we tell someone in Hindi, come home, there are two different ways of saying this thing. One is ghar aao and the other is ghar aiye. The exact literal translation of these two types of sentences in English would be come home and please come home. And the distinction in English is given as informal, come home is informal and please come home is formal. However, if you look at this in the proper context, come home could be a pretty formal request as well, depending on who we are talking to. Whereas, please come home, that is ghar aaiye, may not necessarily be a request. It could definitely be a very formal and a strong thing, but does not necessarily have to be a request. I use my favorite example to understand the distinction between the two in the following sense, that the chief executive of the nation, when talks to his subordinates, or in particular the commanders of police forces or armed forces, we are trying to context the chief of the executive, chief of the armed forces and his subordinates, the commanders. That is the context we are trying to create. So, no matter how polite he wants to be in linguistic structure, and no matter how politely he says something to his subordinates like ghar aaiye, that is the only option to interpret that is as an order, and that remains an order to the subordinate commanders. So, what helps us understand is the structure and how such an structure is interpreted in a social context. So, this example from politeness goes a step further and shows the complex relationship between social context, the linguistic structure, and how it supports or does not support the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. In short, whether or not language structure determines worldview remains an open question for investigation, but the fact that there is a complex relationship between language, society and culture is pretty evident, and the grammar of society, the grammar of culture is deeply embedded in the grammar of language, and the processing and computation of all three, that is the grammar of language, society and culture, work in a very complex way in human mind, are inseparable from one another, requires much more in-depth investigation. Thank you.